Joining us now, U.S. Special Envoy to the Middle East, Steve Witkoff, has also been taking part in those talks between Ukraine and Russia on behalf of the White House. Welcome to Fox News Sunday.
Thank you, Shannon. Thanks for having me.
So we know more talks are set to go between Ukraine and Russia and Saudi Arabia tomorrow, and yet we continue to see these attacks like we've seen in Odessa, like we've seen in Kyiv, leading to death and destruction. The ranking member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Jeanne Shaheen, says this: when Trump asked for the killing to stop, Putin refused. Putin does not want peace, and it is time for the president to realize that. Are you convinced he wants peace?
I feel that he wants peace. The president had two very productive calls this week, or last week, I should say, one with President Zelensky, one with President Putin. I sat and listened to both of them. In both conversations, it was all about a lasting peace. Lots of progress got made last week. The parties agreed to an energy infrastructure moratorium on attacks for energy infrastructure. I think that you're going to see in Saudi Arabia on Monday some real progress, particularly as it affects a Black Sea ceasefire on ships between both countries. And from that, you'll naturally gravitate into a full-on shooting ceasefire.
Okay, you have said recently you don't, quote, I don't regard Putin as a bad guy. You've said you feel like you can negotiate with him, but here's how the National Review describes him. They said he's a tyrant who murders, maims, and imprisons his critics, who has abolished civil society and independent media in Russia, who has invaded a neighbor, engulfing that country in violence for the purpose of crushing and subjugating it. Goes on to say that Russian forces have committed mass kidnapping, torture, rape, and murder under Putin's guidance and leadership. So where do you get to that assessment about him not being a bad guy?
You know, Shannon, I met with President Putin twice. At the direction of the president, because everything I do is at his direction. And they were productive meetings. We accomplished quite a bit. We opened channels of communication. President Putin told me at the first meeting that he had had no conversation with the prior administration, in particular President Biden, for 3.5 years. I'm not sure how anyone would expect an end to a conflict when you're not communicating. So we had a very, very good conversation, productive. We discussed real ways to end this conflict. That led to a second conversation. First conversation being close to 3.5 hours. Second conversation being in that time, in that space as well, 3.5 or 4 hours. That led to agreement. By the end of the second conversation, we had proposals on an energy infrastructure ceasefire and a Black Sea moratorium on firing on each other's ships, and these things had been on the shelf for several years. So, I think that's commendable on the part of all of the parties, and this is at President Trump's direction. His philosophy of peace through strength brings people to the table to clear up misconceptions and to get peace deals done, and that's exactly what's happening right now.
Do you feel like there's a misconception, though, about the characterization of him as a tyrant or someone whose political opponents often disappear or die? I
think in my 68 years on this earth, I've never, ever seen a situation where there isn't two sides to a story. It's just never as black and white as people want to portray. So there are grievances on both sides, but our job, and at the direction, again, I stress, of the president, our job is to narrow the issues, bring the parties together, and stop the killing. That's the game plan, and that's what we're all there to do. And I think that we're doing a pretty effective job of it, and I think you'll see a lot more progress get announced after Monday.
You seem convinced that he doesn't want to expand the territory beyond what he's taken now. I know there's going to be a conversation about how much of that Ukraine does or doesn't get back. But you're convinced that he's not going to go further or have aspirations towards Europe. Obviously, they're concerned about that being much closer to this geographically. But 2014, we had Crimea. That hasn't come back. Why? And he's, gone far beyond that in this most recent attack on Ukraine. So why are you convinced that he won't press further if he's given some reward or some territory this time around?
Well, look, he's been at war for several years. It's in large part been about those 5 regions, and it's in his speeches. There's a view within the country of Russia that these are Russian territories, that there are referendums within these territories that justify these actions. This is not me taking sides. I'm just identifying what the issues are. I've never seen a conflict that can be resolved without level setting the facts, and we're level setting the facts. Now, I've been asked my opinion, so about what President Putin's motives are on a larger scale, and I simply have said that I just don't see that he wants to take all of Europe. This is a much different situation than it was in World War II. In World War II, there was no NATO. So you have countries that are armed there. To me, it just does. I take him at his word in this sense. So, and I think the Europeans are beginning to come to that belief too. But it sort of doesn't matter. That's an academic issue. The real issue here, the agenda set forth by President Trump, he is my boss, and I adhere to that fact. The agenda is stop the killing, stop the carnage. Let's end this thing. You can't end things without communicating with both sides, understanding what each of them need, and then trying to bring them together. And that's what we're doing.
Yeah, and we certainly hope that there's great progress in those talks this week, getting to this point and now moving forward. But I want to make sure while we have you that we ask about the Middle East, where I know you've poured your heart into those negotiations as well. Clearly, the ceasefire is broken there. I know that you said Hamas has been unreasonable in trying to respond to another round of the next phase of a ceasefire. Where do we go from here? What are the odds you get them back to the table and get these hostages home?
Well, I certainly hope we get everybody back to the table and get the hostages home. I was in Doha. I met with many of the Arab leaders at the Arab Summit. I thought we had a deal, an acceptable deal. I even thought we had an approval from Hamas. Maybe that's just me getting duped. But I thought we were there, and evidently we weren't. So this is on Hamas. The United States stands with the state of Israel. There's just that's a 100% commitment, and we've expressed that. Hamas had every opportunity to demilitarize, to accept the bridging proposal that would have given us a 40 or 50-day ceasefire where we could have discussed demilitarization and a final truce. There were all kinds of opportunities to do that, and they elected not to. And this becomes the alternative, and it is unfortunate. Do I think would we be amenable to a reach out from Hamas? Of course we would be. No different than in the Russian conflict. We want to end the killing. But we need to be clear who the aggressor is here, and that is Hamas.
Well, and quickly, I want to ask you before you go about Iran. The president has sent a letter to the supreme leader there giving a timetable for negotiations over their nuke program. 2 months. What happens if you get to the end of the 2 months without progress?
Well, this follows exactly the talking points that me and you have just gone over in Russia, Ukraine, in the Middle East, and now Iran. Our direction, the president made a very, very big move, in my view. It was to reach out to Iran. There are many out there who would have thought that Iran, in their position, would have reached out to us. But we weren't waiting, and it's not a sign of weakness, it's a sign of strength. We don't need to solve everything militarily. It's not to say that if God forbid we're pushed to that point, that we're not going to use military action. We would under certain circumstances. But here where our signal to Hamas, to Iran is, let's sit down and see if we can, through dialogue, through diplomacy, get to the right place. If we can, we're prepared to do that. And if we can't, the alternative is not a great alternative. And I need to be clear so everybody understands President Trump's position on this. Iran cannot have a bomb. We cannot allow them to proceed to weaponization and a nuclear arsenal. It cannot happen, and it will not happen.
Well, you've got several difficult assignments. We know the president has great confidence in you, and we wish you all the best in making progress on these really difficult foreign policy challenges. Steve Witkoff, thank you.
Click here to subscribe to the Fox News YouTube page to catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You won't get it anywhere else.